The last property standing. The first sound was glass breaking. Not cracking, not slipping from someone's hand. Shattering. A crystal vase burst against the hardwood floor of Whitmore Florals, sending water and rose petals sliding in every direction. The shop fell silent. Clara Whitmore stood behind the counter, her hands frozen around a bundle of white peonies. Across from her stood a tall man in a charcoal suit who looked like he had never once been told no in his entire life. His name was Adrian Wolf, 39 years old, founder of Wolf Urban Development, the man responsible for half the modern skyline of Chicago, and the man currently standing inside her flower shop like a stone that had finally arrived. Another vase tipped over. This one didn't fall accidentally. Adrian's arm swept across the counter in a sharp motion. Glass scattered across the floor again. "Sell the building," he said. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. Clara didn't move. The smell of lilies and fresh soil filled the air. "You've made your point," she said calmly. Adrian laughed once under his breath. "My point?" He gestured around the room. "Miss Whitmore, this entire block has been purchased." His voice hardened. "Every building except this one." He pulled the contract from a leather folder and placed it on the counter. "You've ignored 3 offers." Clara glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. "Market value," Adrian continued. "Then double. Then 5 times market value." He leaned forward slightly. "That kind of money changes lives." Clara finally looked him in the eyes. Dark brown eyes, calm, unshaken. "I'm sure it does." She pushed the contract back toward him. "But the shop isn't for sale." Adrian stared at her. For a moment, the only sound in the room was water dripping from a broken vase. "You're sitting on prime downtown real estate," he said. "This building is surrounded by development. It's inevitable." Clara's voice remained soft. "Some things aren't meant to move." Adrian exhaled slowly. "Your neighbors understood that. They all saw it. They made the smart decision." Clara smiled faintly. "My grandmother opened this shop 43 years ago. She gestured to the wooden shelves, the window boxes overflowing with flowers. She built it with her own hands." Adrian's patience snapped. "This isn't a museum. It's a property. It's land. And it's the only piece of land stopping a billion-dollar project." Clara didn't respond. That silence was worse than any argument. Adrian felt something tighten in his chest. Months of delays, investors asking questions, construction teams waiting, millions of dollars frozen because of this one tiny shop. "Name a price," he said again. Clara shook her head. "No." Adrian stared at her. Then something inside him cracked. His hand swept across the nearest display. 3 ceramic pots crashed to the floor. Soil scattered across the wood like black snow. A glass bucket tipped over. Lilies spilled out. "Adrian," Clara started. But he wasn't listening anymore. Months of pressure flooded out all at once. Another shelf. Another crash. Water splashed across the tiles. Flower stems rolled across the floor. By the time Adrian stopped, half the shop looked like a storm had ripped through it. His breathing was heavy. The room was silent again. Clara slowly walked around the counter. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply knelt on the floor and began picking up the flowers one by one, carefully, like they still mattered. Adrian watched her for a long moment. Something about the quiet way she worked made the anger inside him feel strange, uncomfortable. He turned toward the door. "You're making a mistake," he said. Clara didn't look up. "Maybe." She placed the rose gently on the counter. "But it's mine to make." Adrian left without another word. Outside, the city air felt colder. He got into his car and slammed the door. 3 blocks later, his hands were still shaking. 3 hours later, Adrian Wolf stood in a hospital hallway and discovered something that would change everything. The hospital corridors were quiet in the way hospitals often are late in the evening, when the rush of visitors had faded and the night staff had taken over. The lights were softer, the footsteps fewer. The scent of disinfectant lingered in the air. Adrian Wolf walked down the long hallway with the steady pace of someone who had made this trip many times before. For the past 2 months, Tuesday evenings had belonged to this place. Room 614, his mother. Eleanor Wolf had always been the strongest person Adrian knew. Even now, at 72, she carried herself with the stubborn dignity of someone who refused to surrender easily to age or illness. But illness had come anyway. The diagnosis had arrived quickly and without mercy. A rare and aggressive condition that required an equally rare medical procedure. Without it, the doctors had been brutally honest. She would not survive the year. Adrian had spent money the way only a man like him could spend it. Specialists from across the country, private consultations, experimental treatment possibilities. None of it mattered without one thing: a donor. Not just any donor, a donor with an extremely unusual biological compatibility. The odds were microscopic. Adrian had asked everyone: family members, extended relatives, volunteers connected to medical registries. He had even quietly funded expanded screening programs through the hospital in the hope that someone, somewhere might match the requirements. Weeks passed. Nothing. Adrian had begun preparing himself for the possibility that money and influence might not be enough this time. Then, suddenly, everything changed. 3 weeks after the search began, the hospital called. They had found a match. A perfect one. The donor requested complete anonymity. The hospital honored that request without exception. Adrian had tried everything to learn the identity of the person who had saved his mother's life. Lawyers, hospital administrators, private investigators working quietly through medical networks. Every path ended the same way. Confidential. He never found out who the person was. Until tonight. Adrian stepped into the room quietly. His mother was asleep. The soft rhythm of the heart monitor filled the air. A small reading lamp cast a warm circle of light across the bedside table. Eleanor Wolfe looked smaller in the hospital bed than she had ever looked in her life. The sharp edge of illness had softened in recent weeks, replaced by a slow but steady recovery. The doctor said the procedure had been successful. Her body was responding well. For the first time in months, Adrian allowed himself to believe she might actually live. He pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. For a while, he simply watched her sleep. But his mind refused to settle. Instead, it kept returning to the same image. Clara Whitmore, kneeling on the flower shop floor, picking up broken stems one by one. The quiet patience of it had unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Focus," he muttered quietly to himself. A nurse entered the room a few minutes later, carrying a clipboard and a thin folder. She smiled politely when she saw him. "Good evening, Mr. Wolfe." "Evening." She checked the monitors, made a few notes on the chart, and adjusted the blanket around Eleanor's shoulders. "She had a good day," the nurse said softly. "Vitals are stable. Recovery is progressing exactly the way we hoped." Adrian nodded. "Thank you." The nurse placed the folder on the small desk near the window while she finished recording the information in the computer system mounted on the wall. Adrian was not paying attention at first. Medical files rarely interested him. Hospitals ran on paperwork the same way corporations did. Endless documentation that meant very little to anyone outside the system. But as the nurse stepped out briefly to retrieve something from the hallway, the folder on the desk shifted slightly. A corner of a document slid out. A photograph was partially visible. Adrian did not intend to look. At least that is what he told himself afterward. But his eyes moved toward it anyway. Just a glance. He stood and walked toward the desk. The document had the hospital logo across the top. Donor procedure. Identity verification. He should have looked away. Instead, he reached out and gently lifted the paper, and saw the photograph. The world did not exactly stop. It did something stranger. It tilted. The face staring back at him from the small printed image was unmistakable. Dark eyes, calm expression. The same face he had been standing across from that morning. Clara Whitmore. Adrian felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the photo for several seconds before his mind began catching up with what his eyes already understood. No. That was impossible. He flipped the page, scanning the medical identification lines beneath the image. Name, Clara Whitmore. Age, 34. Compatibility classification, perfect match. Adrian dropped back into the chair as if the strength had left his legs. The nurse returned to the room and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Mr. Wolfe?" Adrian held up the paper slowly. "This file," he said carefully. The nurse hesitated. "That is part of the donor procedure documentation. I know what it is." His voice sounded strange even to himself. "What I need to know is whether this photograph is accurate." The nurse looked at the document, then back at Adrian. Her expression shifted slightly. "That information is normally confidential." Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. But there was something in his expression that made the nurse understand he already knew the answer. "Yes," she said quietly, "it is accurate." Adrian leaned back in the chair. "How?" The nurse pulled another chair closer and sat down. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with professional caution. "About a month ago, the hospital began quietly offering voluntary compatibility screening for people willing to be tested. Why? Because your mother's case was unusual. The doctors hoped someone might match the criteria. And this woman volunteered? Yes. Did she know who the patient was? No, the nurse shook her head. She was here delivering flowers for another patient when she overheard staff discussing the screening program." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. "Flowers, of course. She agreed to be tested that same day," the nurse continued. "The odds of compatibility were extremely small. But she matched. A perfect match." Adrian opened his eyes again. "And she asked to remain anonymous." "Yes," the nurse nodded. "She refused compensation as well." Adrian stared at the floor. "Did she say why?" The nurse gave a small thoughtful pause before answering. She said something very simple. "What?" She said someone needed help. And she was able to help. Adrian felt something shift deep in his chest. A memory surfaced again. Clara kneeling on the flower shop floor, quietly gathering broken flowers. He swallowed. Does she know who the patient was? No. And she never asked? No. The nurse folded the document and placed it gently back in the folder. She made one request. Adrian looked up. What was that? That neither the patient nor the patient's family ever be told who she was. The room felt very still. Adrian looked over at the hospital bed. His mother was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the stone now building inside her son. A stranger had saved her life. A stranger who had asked for nothing in return. And that stranger was the same woman he had humiliated only hours earlier. He had destroyed her shop, shattered her flowers, thrown months of quiet care across the floor like trash. Adrian sat there for a long time without speaking. The nurse quietly left the room. The hospital hallway outside hummed with distant activity. But inside the room everything felt silent. Adrian looked down at his hands. For most of his life he had believed something simple about the world. Power solved problems. Money solved problems. Strength solved problems. But none of those things explained what Clara Whitmore had done. And none of them explained the crushing weight now settling over his chest. For the first time in years, Adrian Wolf had no idea what the right move was. But he knew one thing. Tomorrow morning, he was going back to that flower shop. And this time, everything would be different. Morning came slowly over the city, pale sunlight sliding between the tall glass buildings that surrounded the small corner where Whitmore Florals still stood. The street was quieter than usual, the early hour keeping most of the traffic away. Delivery trucks rolled past occasionally, their engines echoing through the narrow stretch of road. Inside the shop, Clara Whitmore was already awake. She had arrived before sunrise. The damage from the day before still lingered everywhere. Broken ceramic had been swept away during the night, but fine dust from the shattered pots still clung to the edges of the wooden floor. A few shelves remained empty where vases had once stood. The scent of crushed lilies and damp soil lingered faintly in the air. Clara moved slowly through the room with a broom in her hands, gathering the last fragments of glass that had escaped her earlier cleaning. The shop looked wounded, but not destroyed. That mattered. She had opened the windows to let in the morning air. Fresh light poured across the counter, where a new bundle of roses rested in a bucket of water. Outside, footsteps approached the door. Clara heard them before she saw him. The bell above the entrance chimed softly. Adrian Wolf stepped inside. He had not slept, that much was obvious. His tie was gone, his collar slightly open, his hair less carefully arranged than usual. For a man known for immaculate control, the small signs of disorder stood out immediately. Clara paused in the middle of sweeping. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like a fragile thread. Adrian looked around the shop. The broken shelves, the empty spaces where flowers had been, the faint scratches across the floor where heavy pots had been dragged aside during the cleaning. Everything he had done yesterday was still visible. He cleared his throat quietly. I went to the hospital last night. Clara said nothing. Adrian stepped further inside, the wooden floor creaking faintly beneath his shoes. My mother's hospital, he continued. Clara leaned the broom gently against the wall. She folded her arms loosely, waiting. Adrian exhaled slowly. There was a file. His voice grew slightly rougher. A donor file. Clara's eyes shifted toward the window for a moment. The sunlight reflected softly in the glass. Adrian watched her carefully. I saw your photograph, he said. The room went still. Clara did not react immediately. She simply looked out toward the street, as if she had been expecting this moment for some time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. You were not supposed to see that. I know. Adrian ran a hand across his forehead. It was an accident. Clara turned back toward him. There was no anger in her expression, but there was something else. Resignation. You know now, she said. Yes. Neither of them moved. Adrian had prepared an entire speech during the drive across the city that morning. Carefully organized sentences, an apology, an offer to repair the damage, an explanation. But now that he was standing in front of her, all of it felt inadequate. I destroyed your shop, he said finally. Clara looked down briefly at the floor. You damaged it, she corrected gently. He nodded once. And you saved my mother's life. Clara did not respond. Adrian stepped closer to the counter. I did not know, he said quietly. I know. That does not excuse what I did. No. The honesty of the answer landed heavily between them. Adrian looked around again. My company will pay for everything, he said. I will replace every vase, every shelf, every flower that was lost. Clara shook her head immediately. No. Adrian frowned slightly. You have not heard the rest of what I am offering. I do not need to, her voice remained calm. I do not want your money. Adrian felt a flash of frustration rise automatically, the same instinct that had guided him through countless negotiations. But this was not a negotiation. You should at least allow me to repair the damage. The damage will be repaired, Clara said. I will repair it. With what resources? With time. Adrian stared at her. You should not have to pay for something I caused. That is not the point. Clara walked toward the counter and adjusted one of the roses in the bucket. The simple movement seemed to help her organize her thoughts. I did not help your mother because I expected anything from you, she said. I did not even know who she was. Adrian remembered the nurse's explanation. You volunteered without knowing the patient. Yes. Why? Clara looked at him again. Because someone needed help. Adrian opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. The simplicity of the answer felt almost unbearable. You risked your own health, he said. Yes. And asked for nothing. Yes, why remain anonymous? Clara gave a small shrug. Gratitude can complicate things. Adrian let out a quiet breath. You should have told me. Clara tilted her head slightly. Why? So I would have known. Her eyes held his for a moment. And what would you have done differently yesterday if you had known? The question landed like a weight. Adrian did not answer. He could not. Clara nodded slowly. That is why I did not tell you. She moved back toward the broom and picked it up again. I did not save your mother for recognition. Adrian's voice grew quieter. Then why did you refuse compensation from the hospital as well? Clara continued sweeping small fragments of glass into a dustpan. My grandmother used to say something. What? She said kindness loses its meaning the moment you attach a price to it. Adrian watched her carefully. Your grandmother owned this shop. Yes. That is why you will not sell. Yes. Adrian looked around the room again. For the first time, he noticed small details he had missed the day before. Photographs on the wall. A framed picture of a younger Clara standing beside an elderly woman with white hair and warm eyes. Handwritten notes from customers pinned to a corkboard. Thank you cards. Old receipts preserved in a small glass frame. This place was not simply a business. It was a memory, a history. Clara, he said quietly. She stopped sweeping again. I will redesign the entire development project if I have to. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. I mean that, Adrian continued. I will find a way to build around this building. Clara studied him carefully. You would lose a lot of money. Yes. You would face resistance from your investors. Yes. Why would you do that? Adrian did not answer immediately. He looked at the floor where shards of glass had been only hours before. Because some things should not be destroyed simply because they are inconvenient. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she shook her head slightly. You do not need to change your entire project. Yes, I do. No, her voice was firmer now. I only need one thing from you. Adrian waited. Clara rested the broom against the counter again. Leave the shop alone. That is all? Yes. No payment? No. No partnership? No. No publicity? No. Adrian studied her expression. She meant every word. Clara Whitmore had saved his mother's life and wanted absolutely nothing in return. The realization created a strange feeling in his chest. It was not anger, it was not confusion. It was something far less familiar. Shame. For most of his life, Adrian Wolf had believed he understood how the world worked. Everything had value. Everything had a price. But standing in that small flower shop, surrounded by broken glass and quiet dignity, he was beginning to understand that some things existed completely outside the system he had built his life around. He nodded slowly. I will leave the shop alone. Clara gave a small nod in return. Thank you. Adrian turned toward the door. He paused before stepping outside. One more thing, he said. Clara looked up. I am still going to repair what I broke. She opened her mouth to protest, but Adrian shook his head gently. Not with money, he said, with effort. Clara watched him carefully, uncertain what he meant. Adrian offered the faintest hint of a tired smile. I suppose I should start by learning how to sweep. Then he stepped out into the morning sunlight, and for the first time in many years, Adrian Wolf walked away from a building he could have owned, because some victories were beginning to feel very different than they once had, and somewhere deep inside him, something had started to change. Adrian Wolf had built his reputation on certainty. For 15 years, every decision he made moved quickly, cleanly, without hesitation. Buildings rose where older structures once stood. Investors trusted him because hesitation cost money, and Adrian had never been a man who hesitated. But the small flower shop on the corner of Maple and 7th had done something unexpected. It slowed him down. 3 days after his conversation with Clara Whitmore, Adrian stood across the street from Whitmore Florals and watched the morning begin. People stopped in front of the window boxes before going to work. A young couple walked inside together, laughing quietly. A delivery driver stepped in with an empty crate and came out a few minutes later carrying a bouquet wrapped in brown paper. None of them looked like wealthy customers, but they looked comfortable, like they belonged there. Adrian leaned against the side of his car and watched. He had not told Clara he would come back. Technically, he had not come back to speak with her. Not yet. Instead, he had spent the last 3 days asking questions. Quiet ones. Questions most people never expected a man like Adrian Wolf to ask. The first place he went was City Records. Whitmore Florals had been registered 43 years earlier under the name Margaret Whitmore, Clara's grandmother. Adrian flipped through scanned permits and property records on a government computer terminal. Renovation permits, electrical inspections, tax documents. The building had never changed ownership, not once. Margaret Whitmore had purchased the property in 1982 for an amount that seemed almost laughably small by modern real estate standards. When she passed away, the shop transferred directly to her granddaughter, Clara Whitmore. No loans, no corporate partnerships, just a small independent business that had survived 4 decades in a city that usually erased places like it without hesitation. Adrian closed the file and sat back in the chair. That alone would have been unusual, but it was not the only thing he learned. The next day, he walked into a small diner 2 blocks from the shop. The place was crowded with construction workers and office employees grabbing quick breakfast before work. The waitress behind the counter looked up when Adrian entered. She blinked twice. Mr. Wolf? Adrian nodded politely. He was used to being recognized. He ordered coffee and sat near the window. After a few minutes, he gestured toward a flower shop visible down the street. The owner, he said casually. Clara Whitmore. How long has she been here? The waitress smiled immediately. Oh, honey, Clara has been here forever. Her grandmother started that shop, another man said from the counter without even turning around. Best flowers in the city. The waitress nodded. That girl saved my sister's wedding when the florist cancelled 2 days before the ceremony. Another voice joined in. She brought flowers to the hospital when my wife had surgery. Someone else laughed softly. She never charges enough for anything. Adrian listened quietly. Nobody spoke about the shop like it was a business. They spoke about it like it was part of their lives. When Adrian finished his coffee, he left a large bill on the table. The waitress tried to return the change. He waved it away. Outside the diner, he stood on the sidewalk again. Across the street, Clara stepped out of the shop carrying a bucket of fresh tulips. A woman walking a dog stopped to talk with her. They laughed about something. The conversation looked effortless, natural. Adrian felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He had spent years reshaping entire neighborhoods, but this small corner of the city had already been shaped by something else. Something quieter. Something that did not appear in contracts or financial projections. Later that afternoon, Adrian walked into the glass tower that housed the headquarters of Wolf Urban Development. The atmosphere inside was very different. Assistants moved quickly through the hallways. Phones rang constantly. Large digital displays in the lobby showed architectural renderings of the future Wolf Center complex. $1 billion development. Luxury residences, retail spaces, restaurants, a public courtyard. The entire project had been carefully engineered down to the smallest detail, except one, the flower shop. Adrian stepped into the conference room on the 32nd floor. 7 people were already waiting. His investors, his chief financial officer, the lead architect. Their expressions were not friendly. Richard Callahan, the senior investment partner, spoke first. We have a problem. Adrian took a seat at the end of the table. I am aware. Callahan slid a folder across the polished surface. We have contractors waiting, equipment on standby, permits that expire if we delay too long. Adrian opened the folder without urgency. Construction timelines, budget projections, cost estimates. Every week this project stalls, costs us money, Callahan continued. Millions. Adrian closed the folder again. I understand. Another investor leaned forward. Then explained why the last property has not been acquired. Adrian remained calm. The owner declined the offer. Raised the offer. She will not sell. Callahan frowned. Everyone sells eventually. Adrian looked directly at him. Not this one. The room grew quiet. The lead architect spoke carefully. The current design requires that parcel. Without it, the layout does not function. Adrian nodded slowly. Then redesigned the layout. The reaction was immediate. That is not practical, one investor said. It will delay construction for months. Then we delay. Callahan leaned forward sharply. You build this company on efficiency, and I will continue to do so. Then remove the obstacle. Adrian folded his hands calmly on the table. The flower shop remains. The room erupted with overlapping objections. You cannot be serious. This is irrational. We already purchased every other property. Adrian waited until the noise settled. Then he spoke quietly. The decision has already been made. Callahan stared at him. Why? Adrian did not answer immediately. Because the real answer would make no sense to them. Because explaining kindness as a financial variable was impossible. Instead, he said something simpler. Because the building stays. Callahan leaned back in his chair slowly. You are risking a fortune over one small shop. Adrian looked out through the massive windows of the conference room. The skyline stretched across the horizon. Buildings he had helped create. Projects that had made him powerful. Perhaps, Adrian said calmly, but not everything is meant to be removed just because it stands in the way. The meeting ended badly. Investors left the room frustrated and angry. Legal teams would begin calling him within the hour. Adrian expected it. He remained in the conference room alone for several minutes after everyone else had gone. Then he stood and walked to the window. From 32 floors above the city, he could almost see the neighborhood where Whitmore Floral stood. A tiny building surrounded by the future. Adrian thought about Clara sweeping the floor after he destroyed her shop. Thought about the way she had refused his money. Thought about the quiet dignity that had unsettled him so deeply. For the first time since Wolf Center had been conceived, Adrian understood that the project was no longer simply about architecture or profit. It had become something else, a choice. Force Clara Whitmore out and finish the project the way it was originally designed, or change everything. And for the first time in his career, Adrian Wolf was beginning to suspect that the most valuable thing he could build might not be the tallest structure on the skyline, but the one small building he chose not to destroy. Outside, across the city, Clara Whitmore closed the door to her shop for the evening and switched off the lights. She had no idea that the man who nearly ruined her life a few days earlier was now standing in a tower of glass and steel, quietly preparing to fight his own empire just to keep her little flower shop standing. The following week began with tension that spread through every floor of Wolf Urban Development. The redesigned plans arrived on Monday morning. Adrian had spent the entire weekend with the lead architect and a small group of engineers, working through every possible configuration that would allow the Wolf Center project to move forward without touching the Whitmore Floral's property. It was not simple. The flower shop sat almost directly in the middle of the original development footprint. The courtyard, retail entrances, and pedestrian walkways had all been designed to flow across that exact parcel. Removing it from the plan was like pulling a stone from the center of a carefully balanced arch. Everything shifted. Everything needed to be reconsidered. The new architectural renderings appeared on the conference room screen as the board gathered again. The building towers still stood tall, sleek glass rising toward the skyline, but the ground level had changed dramatically. The plaza curved inward now. Walkways bent slightly around the central point, and right in the middle of the entire development stood a small rectangular space clearly marked on the layout. Whitmore Florals. The architect spoke carefully as he explained the adjustments. The plaza entrance shifts 15 meters east. Pedestrian traffic will naturally funnel through the courtyard from both streets. He clicked to the next rendering. Instead of removing the shop, we incorporate it into the design. The surrounding structures frame the building. Another investor interrupted immediately. You are designing a $1 billion project around a flower shop. The architect hesitated before answering. Yes. All eyes turned toward Adrian. He sat at the end of the table, calm, watching the screen. Richard Callahan was the first to break the silence. This is absurd. Adrian did not respond immediately. Callahan leaned forward. You are turning the center of a commercial complex into a historical exhibit. It is not a historical exhibit, Adrian said quietly. It is a functioning business that we do not own. Yes. Callahan shook his head slowly. This decision will cost us tens of millions of dollars. Adrian folded his hands. I am aware. Another board member spoke sharply. Then reverse it. Adrian met his gaze. No. The room filled with low voices. One of the investors tapped a pen against the table. You build this company on discipline, and that has not changed. Then act like it. Adrian remained calm. I am. Callahan leaned back in his chair with visible frustration. Explain this to me like I am not the man who invested $300 million into this project. Adrian looked around the table. For years, these people had trusted his instincts. His decisiveness had made them wealthy. But now, the same instinct was guiding him somewhere they could not follow. The project continues, Adrian said. The towers remain unchanged. The retail spaces remain profitable. The plaza becomes more distinctive. He pointed to the screen. The design will draw attention. People will talk about it. Callahan stared at the image of the small shop sitting inside the massive courtyard. You are gambling the reputation of this company on sentiment. Adrian did not argue. Perhaps Callahan was right. But the decision had already been made. If the board wishes to pursue legal action, Adrian said calmly, that is your right. The room grew quiet again. Callahan studied him for several seconds. You are serious? Yes. You would rather face lawsuits than remove one building. Adrian nodded. Yes. The meeting ended with tension hanging in the air like a storm that had not yet broken. Several investors left without speaking to him. Lawyers would become involved soon. Adrian expected nothing less. But as he stepped out of the conference room, something inside him felt strangely steady. For once, the direction ahead seemed clear. Across the city, Clara Whitmore was standing on a ladder inside her shop, trying to repair a damaged shelf. The wood had cracked when one of the heavy ceramic pots had been knocked over days earlier. She tightened the screw slowly, holding the board steady with one hand. The shop was open again, but it was not easy. Half the display vases had been broken. Several rare arrangements had been ruined. Replacing everything cost more than Clara liked to think about. She had already dipped into the small savings account she kept for emergencies. Still, the shop smelled like fresh flowers again. Buckets of daisies lined the front window. A delivery truck had arrived that morning with tulips and roses. Clara climbed down from the ladder and stepped back to examine the shelf. It held, for now. The bell above the door chimed softly. A familiar voice called out, "Morning, Clara." She smiled. Mrs. Alvarez from the bakery down the street walked inside carrying the small box. "I brought pastries," the older woman said. "You have been working too hard." Clara laughed quietly. "That is very kind of you." Mrs. Alvarez set the box on the counter and looked around the shop. "You are fixing everything." "Trying. You should have called me sooner." Clara opened the pastry box. "You already helped by bringing breakfast." The woman studied her carefully. "You know the man who did this owns half the city." "I am aware." "Are you going to sell the building?" Clara shook her head. "No." Mrs. Alvarez smiled approvingly. "Good." Clara took a bite of the pastry. The warm sweetness reminded her she had skipped breakfast. "You know," Mrs. Alvarez continued thoughtfully, "everyone in the neighborhood heard what happened." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Everyone?" "Of course. Nothing stays quiet around here." Clara laughed softly. "And what exactly did they hear? That you refused to sell your shop to a billionaire?" Clara shook her head. "That is not the dramatic story people think it is." Mrs. Alvarez leaned closer. "It is to them." Outside the shop window, a group of construction workers walked past on their way to a nearby site. One of them waved through the glass. Clara waved back. The small shop had always been part of the neighborhood, but now it felt like the neighborhood was quietly protecting it. Clara looked around the room again. The repairs were slow, the finances were tight, but the flowers were blooming again. Meanwhile, several miles away, inside a sleek office tower, Adrian Wolf stood in his private office, reviewing the revised development contracts. The legal department had already delivered the first warning. 2 investors were considering formal action, another had demanded a renegotiation of their agreement. Adrian read each document carefully. None of it surprised him. Financial pressure was the language of the world he had built. But now the pressure felt different, because this time he was choosing it. He closed the final document and leaned back in his chair. Through the massive glass windows of his office, the skyline stretched endlessly across the horizon. Buildings he had shaped, neighborhoods he had transformed, projects that had made him powerful. Yet none of them occupied his thoughts the way a small flower shop now did. He remembered the quiet determination in Clara's voice when she told him the building was not for sale. He remembered the way she had refused his money without hesitation, and he remembered something else, a nurse's quiet voice in a hospital room. She said someone needed help, and she was able to help. Adrian looked out at the city again. For years he had believed success meant conquering obstacles. Now he was beginning to understand something far more difficult. Sometimes the strongest decision was simply choosing not to destroy something fragile, even if it meant going to war with his own empire, and that war had only just begun. Somewhere across the city, Clara Whitmore locked the shop door for the night and switched off the lights. She did not know that her small building had become the center of a battle that was quietly shaking one of the most powerful development companies in the city. But the flowers inside the shop were blooming again, and sometimes that was enough. Autumn arrived quietly that year, carrying with it cooler air and the faint scent of fallen leaves that drifted through the streets of the city. Construction around the future Wolf Center site had begun in earnest. Steel frames rose slowly into the sky, cranes turning like patient giants above the skyline. Yet in the middle of the growing forest of glass and metal, one small building remained untouched: Whitmore Florals. People had begun to notice the unusual sight. Reporters occasionally asked questions about the design decision, curious why such a small property had been preserved in the center of such an expensive development. Adrian Wolf answered them politely but vaguely. It made the design more interesting, he would say, but the truth behind that decision remained something only a few people understood. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the confrontation in the flower shop, Adrian drove his mother across the city. Eleanor Wolf had recovered enough strength to leave the hospital regularly now. Her doctor still advised caution, but her spirit had returned fully. She sat beside Adrian in the passenger seat, watching the streets move past the window. "You seem distracted today," she said. Adrian glanced at her briefly. "Work." "That is your usual answer," he smiled faintly. "I suppose it is." Eleanor studied him with the perceptive gaze that had unsettled him since childhood. "You have been visiting the hospital less often lately. That is a good sign," Adrian said. "It means you are healthier." She laughed softly. "Flattery will not distract me." Adrian turned the car onto Maple Street. "We are here." Eleanor looked out the window. Construction fencing lined much of the block. Tower cranes loomed above unfinished structures. But at the center of the street stood a small building with flower boxes beneath its windows and a wooden sign hanging above the door. "Whitmore Florals." Eleanor frowned slightly. "You brought me to a flower shop?" "Yes, why?" Adrian parked the car. "There is someone I would like you to meet." They stepped onto the sidewalk together. Eleanor moved slowly but confidently, leaning lightly on Adrian's arm as they walked toward the entrance. Inside the shop, Clara Whitmore was arranging a display of autumn chrysanthemums when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up automatically. For a moment she did not recognize the woman entering beside Adrian. Then her eyes widened slightly. Eleanor Wolf looked older than Clara remembered from the hospital, but the face was unmistakable. The two women stared at each other quietly. Adrian noticed the strange pause. "Clara," he said gently. "This is my mother, Eleanor." Clara set the flowers down carefully. "Mrs. Wolf." Eleanor stepped further into the shop, her gaze drifting slowly around the room. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Sunlight poured through the front windows. Something in her expression softened. "This place feels familiar," she murmured. Adrian watched both women carefully. "Clara owns the shop," he explained. Eleanor nodded absently, her attention drawn to a framed photograph sitting on the counter. It showed a younger Clara standing beside an elderly woman with white hair and kind eyes. Eleanor stepped closer. Her breathing slowed. For a long moment she stared at the photograph. Then something in her face changed completely. "Adrian," she said quietly. "Yes?" Her voice trembled slightly. "Where did you say this shop was?" "Maple Street." Eleanor turned slowly toward Clara. "What was your grandmother's name?" Clara felt a strange sensation in her chest. "Margaret Whitmore." Eleanor inhaled sharply. Her hand reached out to touch the edge of the photograph. "Margaret," she whispered. Adrian frowned. "You knew her?" Eleanor's eyes grew distant, as though she were looking back through decades of memory. "I did not know her well," she said slowly, "but I will never forget her." Clara remained very still. "What happened?" Adrian asked. Eleanor moved to a nearby chair and sat down carefully. "This was many years ago," she began. "Long before you built your company. Long before we had any money." Adrian listened quietly. "When your father died," she continued, "things became very difficult." Her voice softened. "You were only 12 years old." Adrian remembered those years well. The small apartment, the constant worry about bills. But he had never heard the full story. "One winter afternoon," Eleanor said, "I had been working 2 jobs. I had not eaten much for several days. I remember walking down this very street in the cold." She looked around the shop again. I must have collapsed outside. Clara felt her heart beat faster. I woke up inside this shop, Eleanor continued. A woman had brought me in from the sidewalk. She pointed gently at the photograph. That woman, Margaret Whitmore, Clara's grandmother. Eleanor smiled faintly at the memory. She sat me down in a chair near the window. She gave me hot tea and bread. She refused to let me leave until I had warmed up. Adrian leaned against the counter silently. I tried to pay her, Eleanor said. She refused. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. That sounds like her. Eleanor nodded. When I finally left, she handed me a small bouquet of flowers. Her eyes filled with emotion. She said something I have never forgotten. What did she say? Adrian asked quietly. Eleanor looked directly at Clara. She said kindness always comes back around. The shop fell silent. Clara felt tears gather in the corners of her eyes. My grandmother used to say that all the time, she whispered. Eleanor studied her carefully. When I heard the name Whitmore at the hospital after my surgery, something felt familiar, but I did not make the connection. Adrian looked between them both. You recognized her name? Clara nodded slowly. When the doctors mentioned Eleanor Wolfe, I remembered my grandmother telling me about a woman she once helped during a difficult winter. Eleanor's eyes widened. You knew? Clara nodded again. Yes. Adrian stared at her. You knew my mother was that woman? Yes. And you still never told anyone? Clara smiled softly. It did not seem important. Adrian shook his head in disbelief. You volunteered for surgery to save her life. She saved ours first, Clara said gently. Adrian frowned. What do you mean? Clara looked around the small shop. My grandmother struggled to keep this place open during the early years. Some days she barely made enough to pay the bills. She gestured toward the window. But she always believed kindness had value beyond money. Eleanor smiled quietly. That sounds exactly like her. Clara folded her hands lightly on the counter. When I heard your name at the hospital, I realized the kindness she showed someone years ago had come full circle. Adrian looked at the two women, stunned. So you saved my mother because your grandmother once helped her? Clara shook her head gently. No. Then why? She looked at Eleanor. Because she would have done the same thing. Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She reached across the counter and took Clara's hand. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Clara smiled softly. She taught me everything I know. Outside the shop window, the cranes of the Wolfe Center project turned slowly above the skyline. Steel beams rose higher each day. But inside the small flower shop, something far older and more powerful had quietly revealed itself. A kindness that had begun decades earlier, passed from one generation to the next, and finally returned. Adrian stood silently, absorbing the full weight of the story unfolding before him. For the first time he truly understood. The flower shop had never simply been a building. It was the living proof of something his entire world of business had never fully measured. Kindness. And the strange, beautiful way it sometimes found its way back home. In the weeks that followed, the city moved forward the way cities always did, with cranes rising, sidewalks filling, and the constant rhythm of construction echoing through the streets. The Wolfe Center towers climbed steadily higher above the skyline, steel skeletons slowly transforming into something more permanent. But Adrian Wolfe found himself spending less time watching the towers. Instead, he began stopping by Whitmore Florals. At first, he came quietly in the early mornings before the shop opened. The street would still be mostly empty, the light soft and grey before the sun fully rose above the buildings. Clara would already be inside, arranging flowers or preparing the day's orders. The first time Adrian returned after bringing his mother to meet her, he did not arrive in a suit. He wore simple clothes, the kind he had not worn in years. A dark jacket, jeans, work gloves tucked into one pocket. Clara noticed immediately. You are early, she said as he stepped inside. I thought you might need help. She looked at the gloves in his hand. You run a construction company? Yes. You have hundreds of employees who could repair this shop in a single afternoon? Yes. Clara folded her arms lightly. Then why are you here? Adrian set the gloves on the counter. Because you asked me not to pay for the damage. And? I did not promise I would not fix it. Clara studied him carefully. You are very persistent. So I have been told. For a moment she considered arguing further, but then she glanced toward the back wall where one of the display cabinets still leaned slightly to one side, its base damaged from the day Adrian lost his temper. Finally she sighed. Fine. Adrian raised an eyebrow. That sounds less enthusiastic than I hoped. You may help, Clara said, pointing toward the cabinet. But if you break anything else, you are leaving. He nodded. Fair. The repair took longer than Adrian expected. The cabinet had to be emptied carefully, glass shelves removed one at a time. The wooden base had split where it had struck the floor, and the supporting joint needed reinforcement. Adrian knelt on the floor with tools spread around him. Clara worked nearby, arranging bouquets for the morning customers. Neither of them spoke much at first, but the silence felt different now. Not tense, just quiet. After an hour, Clara walked over with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him. You missed the screw, she said, pointing to the corner of the cabinet. Adrian followed her finger and laughed softly. I suppose managing construction sites does not automatically make someone a good carpenter. Clara leaned against the counter. Most people who run companies like yours do not repair furniture personally. Adrian tightened the missing screw. Most people who run companies like mine do not destroy flower shops either. Clara did not answer immediately, but when she did, her voice carried less sharpness than before. That was a very bad day for you. Yes. And for me. Yes. He looked up at her. I am still sorry. Clara met his eyes for a moment before nodding once. I know. The cabinet stood straight again by the time the first customers began arriving. Adrian stepped back to examine his work. Not perfect, he admitted, but stable. Clara ran her hand along the repaired edge. It will hold. She paused. Thank you. Adrian nodded once. The next morning he returned again, and the morning after that. Sometimes the work was simple, replacing cracked shelves, repairing a loose hinge on the wooden door, installing stronger brackets beneath the window boxes outside. Other times he simply carried heavy deliveries from the sidewalk into the shop. Clara pretended not to notice how quickly the tasks that had taken her hours alone now disappeared in minutes with an extra pair of hands. Word in the neighborhood spread quickly. The billionaire developer who owned half the skyline was now occasionally seen unloading flower crates. Mrs. Alvarez from the bakery was the first to comment directly. She walked into the shop one afternoon, saw Adrian adjusting a display stand, and nearly dropped the pastry box she was carrying. Well, she said loudly, this is something I never expected to see. Adrian glanced up with mild amusement. Good afternoon. Mrs. Alvarez placed the box on the counter and leaned closer to Clara. You have him working now? Clara tried very hard not to smile. He volunteered. Mrs. Alvarez looked back at Adrian. Be careful, she warned him. Once Clara starts giving you tasks, you may never escape. Adrian chuckled. I suspect that may already be happening. Over time, the work became less about repairing damage and more about maintaining the shop. Adrian learned how to trim stems properly, how to arrange the heavy buckets of flowers so the shop floor remained balanced, how to secure delicate arrangements for customers traveling long distances. He was terrible at wrapping bouquets. Clara laughed openly the first time she watched him attempt it. That looks like you are packaging fragile electronics, not flowers. I am used to steel and concrete, Adrian said defensively. Flowers require more patience. I am learning. Yes, Clara said softly. You are. Their conversations grew easier with each passing week. Sometimes they spoke about the shop, sometimes about the neighborhood, occasionally about Adrian's construction project rising around them. One evening, they stood together outside the shop, watching the sunset reflect off the half-finished towers of Wolf Center. The steel frames caught the orange light like mirrors. It is beautiful, Clara admitted. Adrian looked surprised. You think so? Yes, she glanced toward the cranes moving slowly against the sky. You are building something that will last a long time. Adrian nodded. That is the idea. Clara looked back at the small shop behind them. My grandmother used to say buildings are like gardens. How so? They only last if someone keeps caring for them. Adrian smiled faintly. She sounds wise. She was. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Adrian spoke again. You know, he said thoughtfully, when this project is finished, thousands of people will pass through this plaza every day. Clara raised an eyebrow. That sounds exhausting. Adrian laughed softly. But they will see your shop. Clara looked at him. And perhaps some of them will stop. She considered that. Flowers tend to do that. Adrian turned slightly toward her. I am glad you did not sell. Clara studied him carefully. So am I. The words hung between them longer than either expected. For a moment, neither moved. Something subtle had changed. The tension that once filled the air between them had softened into something warmer. Something neither of them fully understood yet. But both of them could feel it growing quietly, the same way flowers did when given enough time and patience. And somewhere deep inside Adrian Wolf, a man who had once believed everything important in life could be built with money and steel, was discovering a different kind of construction entirely. One made not of towers, but of trust. The grand opening of Wolf Center arrived on a clear spring morning, nearly a year after the first steel beams had risen above Maple Street. The city had been waiting for months. News stations parked their vans along the sidewalks, photographers prepared their cameras. The polished glass towers reflected the morning sun, sending bright light across the plaza that stretched between the buildings like a new public square. People gathered early, curious to see the development that had already been described as one of the most ambitious urban projects in the city's history. Adrian Wolf stood near the edge of the crowd, speaking quietly with his project director, while reporters moved through the plaza, capturing footage of the finished complex. The Wolf Center towers were magnificent. 3 tall glass buildings surrounded a wide open courtyard filled with stone walkways, trees, and carefully designed gardens. A circular fountain stood near the center, its clear water catching the sunlight as it flowed gently over the smooth stone edges. Restaurants and small boutiques lined the ground floor of the towers. Office workers had already begun arriving in the upper floors during the weeks leading up to the official opening, but the most unusual detail of the entire design stood directly at the heart of the plaza. A small, familiar building, Whitmore Florals. The flower shop had not been moved. It had not been remodeled into something modern and unrecognizable. Instead, the entire plaza had been built around it. Stone paths curved gently toward the shop from every direction, guiding visitors naturally to its wooden door. Flower beds surrounded the building, blooming with colors that changed with the seasons. Benches had been placed nearby so people could sit among the scent of fresh flowers while watching the quiet life of the plaza unfold around them. In the middle of a billion-dollar development of glass and steel stood a simple flower shop that had existed long before the towers, and it looked completely at home. Clara Whitmore stood inside the shop that morning, arranging the final display of roses near the window. The bell above the door rang as someone stepped inside. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. "You are early," she said. Adrian Wolf smiled slightly as he walked toward the counter. Today seemed like an important day to arrive early. Clara placed the final rose carefully into the arrangement and stepped back to examine the bouquet. Outside the window, people were already gathering in the plaza. "I never imagined this many people would come just to see a collection of buildings," she said. "They are not coming just to see buildings." Clara turned to face him. "No?" Adrian gestured toward the window. "They are coming to see the story." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And what story would that be?" Adrian stepped closer to the window and looked out at the plaza. The story of a man who believed everything valuable in the world could be measured in money. Clara leaned lightly against the counter. "That sounds like a very typical story." Adrian nodded. "Yes, it was." He turned back toward her. "Until he tried to destroy a flower shop." Clara studied his expression carefully. "You did more than try." "Yes," Adrian said quietly. "I did." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The memory of that day still lingered somewhere in the walls of the shop, though the damage had long since been repaired. Adrian continued softly. "I thought I was protecting my business, protecting my project, protecting my future." Clara folded her hands. "And now?" Adrian glanced toward the plaza again. "Now, I realize I was protecting the wrong things." Outside, a group of visitors stopped near the entrance of the shop, admiring the flowers displayed in the windows. Some of them pointed curiously at the small building surrounded by the massive towers. Clara followed his gaze. "It is strange, is it not?" she said. "What is?" "That something so small can attract so much attention." Adrian smiled. "It turns out people notice the things that feel real." Clara watched a young couple approach the door of the shop, hesitating slightly before stepping inside to look around. "They probably think it is part of the design," she said. "In a way, it is." She looked back at him. "You redesigned an entire development for this building." "Yes." "Your investors nearly revolted." "Yes." "You lost a great deal of money." Adrian shrugged lightly. "I gained something better." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And what would that be?" Adrian met her eyes. "Perspective." Clara smiled faintly. "My grandmother would have liked that answer." Adrian glanced at the framed photograph of Margaret Whitmore still resting on the counter. "I often think about what she said to my mother all those years ago." Clara nodded. "Kindness always comes back around." "Yes." He looked around the shop once more. "And sometimes it grows into something far bigger than anyone expected." The door opened again as more visitors stepped inside, drawn by the scent of fresh flowers drifting out into the plaza. Outside, the grand opening ceremony was about to begin. City officials were gathering near the fountain. Reporters were preparing their microphones. Adrian knew they would soon call him to the stage to speak about the project. About innovation, about economic development, about the future of the city. But standing inside the small flower shop, he realized those speeches suddenly felt less important. Because the most meaningful part of the entire project was not the towers rising above them. It was the building that had been there all along. The one he once tried to erase. Clara stepped beside him near the window as they watched the plaza slowly fill with people. Families walked along the cursed paths. Office workers paused to photograph the fountain. Children ran between the benches laughing. And again, people drifted toward a small shop in the center. Adrian spoke quietly. "You know something?" "What?" "This is the smallest building in the entire plaza." Clara smiled. "Yes." He looked at her. "And somehow it became the most important one." She said nothing for a moment. Then she simply reached for a pair of pruning scissors and returned to trimming a bouquet of lilies near the window. Outside, the glass towers of Wolf Center shone brightly in the sunlight. But at the center of it all, surrounded by flowers and quiet life, stood the place that had changed everything. A small shop, a simple act of kindness, and a lesson Adrian Wolf would carry for the rest of his life.